There is an invisible chain that binds us to the past. It is not made of iron nor of sentimental memory. It is woven with numbers, with prices, with that first value our eyes saw, that initial figure that, like a brand of fire on skin, will never abandon us again. We call this anchoring, this cognitive bias that transforms the first fragment of information into a dead weight tied to our judgment. No matter how irrelevant that initial number may be, no matter that the world around us has changed completely, the anchor remains, and we, like castaways trapped at the ocean's bottom, refuse to cut it. This is a fable about a man who loved a price more than he loved truth, about how an ancient figure can blind eyes to present value, and about the terrible cost of believing that the past is a reliable map for the future. Listen, then, to the story of the collector and the clock that never told the right time. There was a man in a city forgotten by time, where the streets were of irregular stone and windows remained closed even under the midday sun. This man was known simply as the collector, not of art, not of valuable antiques, but of common objects to which he attributed extraordinary values. His house was a private museum of distorted pricing, where each item carried not its market value, but the price he had paid, or, more importantly, the price he had first seen. In a dark corner of his room, illuminated only by a candle that never consumed itself completely, rested his most cherished possession, a silver pocket watch. The collector had not purchased it at auction, nor inherited it from an illustrious ancestor. He had acquired it at a common market, from a street vendor who shouted his offer like a herald of kings. 50 gold coins, the vendor had said. This watch belonged to a count, marked the hours of history, worth more than it weighs. The collector, like so many of us, heard this number and felt something solidify in his mind. 50 gold coins. It did not matter that the vendor was known for his fantastic stories. It did not matter that the watch was scratched, that its mechanism creaked, that the chain was stained by the rust of abandonment. The number had been cast like an anchor in the ocean of his perception, and now lay at the bottom, immobile and absolute. He bargained as every prudent buyer should, and took the watch for 30 coins. A bargain, he thought. A treasure acquired for less than its true value. That number, 50, became the reality against which everything else would be measured. Years passed like dry leaves carried by autumn wind. The city changed. The market where the collector had bought his watch was demolished to make way for an empty square. The street vendors disappeared or died. But the collector guarded his watch like a dragon guards gold, and the number 50 remained engraved in his mind with more clarity than the markings on the watch's own face. He began to frequent auctions and antique houses, always carrying the watch in his vest pocket, always waiting for the moment when someone would recognize its true value. When appraisers looked at the object, their faces remained neutral, their expressions carefully polished by the practice of giving bad news. 6 coins, some said. 8, if we find the right buyer, others said. One of them, more honest or more cruel, simply shook his head and said, "This is fair jewelry, sir, not worth the metal that composes it." The collector refused all offers with philosophical indignation. How could these self-proclaimed specialists not see what he saw? How could they value in coins what had been proclaimed in gold? This is the paradox of anchoring. The more we cling to our initial number, the less we can see the numbers the world around us is shouting. Reality becomes an illusion, and illusion, reality. The anchoring bias is not simply about prices, it is about identity. The collector was not defending the value of a watch. He was defending his own capacity for judgment, his first impression, his belief that that initial figure was a revealed truth and not merely a calculated suggestion from a clever vendor. Meanwhile, the financial world spun on its inexorable wheel. Markets rose and fell like lunar tides. Stocks that had been bought for 100 were sold for 10, but their owners refused to accept the loss, trapped by the memory of the entry price. Houses that had cost fortunes during speculative bubbles remained empty, their owners preferring to let them rot than to sell them for less than the purchase value. It was the collector multiplied by millions, each holding their own broken watch, each insisting that the past was more real than the present. Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who mapped the treacherous territories of the human mind, demonstrated this phenomenon with brutal elegance. Present someone with a number, any number, before asking a question about value, and that number will become the unconscious reference point. Ask if a wine costs more or less than 50 reais before requesting a price estimate, and even if the number 50 was chosen randomly, it will pull answers in its direction like the gravity of a dark planet. Anchoring does not respect experience, nor intelligence, nor education. It is one of the most persistent and pernicious biases because it operates below the threshold of consciousness. We believe we are making independent judgments when, in fact, we are merely orbiting around the first number presented to us. The collector did not know this, but his behavior was a living treatise on this principle. He had anchored his judgment not only on the price of 50 coins, but on the story that accompanied it, on the narrative of nobility and historical importance. And like all strong anchors, this one combined number and emotion, fact and fiction, in a knot impossible to untie. One day, already old and bent by the weight of years and unexamined certainties, the collector met a young watchmaker in the square that had replaced the old market. This young man had clear eyes and hands stained by the silver of polishing. The collector, always hopeful for validation, showed him the watch. The watchmaker held the object with delicacy, opened the back cover with a fine tool, examined the mechanism with the concentration of a surgeon. Finally, he spoke. "This watch was mass-produced 40 years ago. I see 3 identical to this one every week. The mechanism is worn beyond repair. As a functional object, it is worth nothing. As a museum piece or antique, neither, for there is nothing unique about it. If it has sentimental value, that is another matter. But in the open market, sir, this is worth the weight of the silver, 2 coins, perhaps 3. The collector felt something rupture inside him, not like glass that shatters, but like rope that slowly rots until one last fiber gives way. 2 coins. The number was an obscenity, a blasphemy against decades of belief. But for the first time, a fissure opened in his certainty. And for the first time, he allowed himself to ask the question he had avoided for an entire lifetime. What if the vendor had lied? What if the initial price had been merely an invention, an anchor deliberately cast to create the illusion of value? This is the terrible revelation that awaits at the end of all irrational attachment to past prices. It is not merely that we were wrong about the value, it is that our very identity as competent judges, as astute investors, as people who know what things are worth, was built on quicksand from the beginning. The collector returned home that night under a starless sky. He placed the watch back in its dark corner, but something had changed. The anchor, for the first time in decades, had moved slightly. In the days that followed, he began to examine his other possessions with new eyes. A painting he insisted was worth 100 coins because that was what the seller had asked. A set of books he refused to sell for less than 20, although no one wanted them even for 5. Each object was an anchor. Each price was a prison. He had spent his entire life not collecting things, but collecting numbers to which he had attached himself with the ferocity of a castaway clinging to wreckage. This is the curse of anchoring in the world of investments and personal finance. We buy a stock for 100 and refuse to sell it for 90, even when all evidence suggests it will fall to 50. We buy a house at the market peak and refuse to accept that its value has plummeted, preferring the fantasy of recovery to the reality of loss. The entry price becomes our identity, and selling it below that point would be admitting not just a financial error, but an error of judgment, a fundamental failure of our ability to navigate the world. The anchor is not just a number. It is a piece of our ego sunk in the ocean, and cutting it would be like amputating a part of ourselves. The problem is aggravated by the way markets present information. When you open an investment app, the first thing you see is not the isolated current value, but the current value in relation to your purchase price, plus 20% in green, minus 15% in red. The software was designed to reinforce the anchor, to ensure you never forget that initial price. And for most people, this design is psychologically devastating. They do not make decisions based on the correct question. Given what I know today, would I buy this asset at the current price? Instead, they make decisions based on the wrong question. How do I recover my entry price? The first question looks to the future. The second is trapped in the past. The collector, in his final years, developed a strange practice that his neighbors found incomprehensible. He began to cover the prices of all objects in his house. He placed small pieces of fabric over the tags, wrote new descriptions that did not mention values, forced himself to look at each item as if seeing it for the first time. It was an exercise in de-anchoring, an attempt to break the chains he himself had forged. It did not always work. Memory is persistent, and some numbers had been engraved so deeply that no amount of fabric could hide them. But occasionally, he managed to see an object with new eyes, to ask himself not what he had paid, but what it would be worth now, in this moment, in this context, to someone who did not carry the weight of its history. This is the discipline that the best investors cultivate, although few master it completely. They train themselves to ignore entry prices, to treat each position as if they had just acquired it today, to ask the crucial question: if I did not own this, would I buy it now? If the answer is no, then holding the position is an error, no matter how much you paid for it. Warren Buffett, whose financial wisdom sometimes approaches the philosophical, said something the collector would have benefited from hearing. Price is what you pay, value is what you get. But he could have added, and the price you paid has no relation whatsoever to the value you receive today. The anchoring bias extends beyond individual investments to infect entire markets. During speculative bubbles, past prices become collective psychological anchors that prevent the acceptance of reality. Those who bought Bitcoin at $60,000 refuse to sell at $20,000, creating a layer of obstinate holders who prefer the illusion of recovery to the certainty of realized loss. Real estate markets can remain frozen for years after a crash, with sellers anchored to peak prices and buyers waiting for gravity to finally overcome stubbornness. Collective anchoring creates friction, reduces liquidity, distorts price formation. It is a form of mass denial, a tacit agreement that the numbers of the past are more real than the numbers of the present. There is also a disturbing ethical dimension to this bias. Astute. Sellers know it and deliberately exploit it. Why do you think the initial price in negotiations is always absurdly high? Why is that used car advertised for a value everyone knows is fantasy? Because the seller is casting an anchor, establishing a reference point that will make any subsequent discount seem like a generous concession. You leave the negotiation thinking you got a bargain at 70% of the initial price, without realizing that 70% of an inflated number can still be more than the real value. The collector was a victim of this tactic, but in the modern economy, we all are, repeatedly, from the crossed-out price on the store tag to the list value the car salesman mentions before offering his special discount. The collector's final night arrived as all last nights arrive, without announcement and without ceremony. He was sitting in his favorite chair, the silver watch finally open in his hand. The mechanism had been stopped for years, the gears frozen by rust and neglect. He looked at the object not with the love of a collector, but with the cold clarity of someone who finally sees. This was never worth 50 coins, he whispered to the emptiness of the room. And realizing this does not make me a fool. It makes me free. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he had made a decision. The next morning, he would sell the watch for whatever price the market offered. Not because he needed the money, but because he needed the freedom. He needed to prove to himself that he could cut the anchor, that he could choose the present over the past, reality over memory. This is the lesson of the anchor you can never forget, until you consciously choose to forget it. The first price you see, the first valuation you receive, the first number you hear is just that, a number. It is not revealed truth. It is not intrinsic value. It is not destiny. It is simply the starting point of a negotiation, a suggestion cast into the void, hoping your mind will capture it and transform it into reality. Your only defense is awareness of this vulnerability, the knowledge that you are constantly being anchored, constantly being pulled to orbit around arbitrary numbers. And the practical defense is simple in theory, brutal in execution. Always question the first number. Always ask why that value and not another. Always seek independent reference points, multiple sources, different contexts. In the world of investments, this means developing your own methodology of valuation, a way to estimate value that does not depend on the current price or the entry price. It means forcing yourself to write, before buying any asset, the specific and quantifiable reasons why you believe it is undervalued or has growth potential. And it means reviewing those reasons periodically, asking yourself if they are still valid, regardless of what you paid. If the reasons have evaporated but you still hold the position, you are not investing, you are merely refusing to admit an error. You are trapped at the ocean's bottom, looking up through dark water, seeing the distant light of the surface but unable to cut the rope that binds you. The deepest philosophical truth about anchoring is that it reveals our problematic relationship with time. We treat the past as if it were more certain, more solid, more real than the fluid present and nebulous future. A price we paid 5 years ago seems like an immutable fact, while today's price seems temporary, subject to correction. But this is an illusion. The past is not more real than the present. It is merely more dead, incapable of changing, and therefore offers us the false security of certainty. Anchoring is nostalgia applied to numbers. It is the refusal to accept that the world has changed, that our initial judgment may have been flawed, that the only relevant direction is forward. The collector spent decades looking backward to the moment in the market when a vendor shouted a number. He could have spent those decades looking forward, asking not what the watch was worth when he bought it, but what it could be worth, whom it could serve, what use it could have in the world as it is now. There are practical techniques to combat anchoring, developed by both behavioral psychologists and professional traders. One is the automatic stop-loss rule. Decide before buying any asset what percentage of decline you are willing to tolerate. And when that point is reached, sell automatically, without reflection, without negotiating with yourself. This removes the anchor from the equation because the decision was already made when you were still rational, before the bias could infect your judgment. Another technique is the reversal exercise. Regularly imagine that you own none of your assets, that your portfolio is in cash, and then ask yourself, given what I know today, which of these assets would I buy again? Those you would not buy should be sold, regardless of profit or loss. But perhaps the most powerful technique is the simplest. Never look at the entry price. Configure your systems to show only current value and percentage change for the day. Force yourself to forget what you paid. Treat each morning as if your portfolio had been assembled by someone else and you are merely deciding whether to maintain or modify it. This is difficult, almost impossible for most people, because ego is intertwined with entry price. Admitting you paid too much is admitting you judged poorly, and most of us prefer to lose money than to admit error. This irrational preference, this fierce protection of self-esteem at the expense of real wealth, is what makes anchoring so lethal. It is not merely a calculation error, it is a ritual sacrifice of reality on the altar of ego. The final fate of the collector's watch is less important than his decision to finally sell it. It may have received 2 coins, it may have received 3, it may have been melted for its weight in silver. What matters is that he cut the anchor, chose the present over the past, accepted that 50 was never real, and in this acceptance he found not defeat, but a strange form of victory. The victory of one who finally sees clearly, even if too late to recover the lost years. This is the bitter promise of awareness. It does not undo your mistakes, but it can prevent you from repeating them. So ask yourself now, what is your watch? What is the asset you refuse to sell because the market price does not correspond to the number engraved in your memory? What is the property that rots while you wait for the market to recognize its true value, a value that perhaps never existed outside your imagination? What stock do you hold not because you believe in its future, but because selling now would be admitting that the entry price was an error? These are uncomfortable questions, designed to reveal the anchors you carry without realizing, and the answer to each is the same. The only price that matters is today's. The only relevant value is that which the market, in its cruel and indifferent wisdom, attributes at this moment. The past offers no refuge. The anchor does not protect you from drowning, it ensures it. Subscribe to discover the hidden truths behind every financial decision. The dark fables that explain why we do what we do with our money and our lives. And if you find value in this story, if it resonates with some anchor you carry, leave a comment. Share what number you cannot forget. What price has become your prison? Because recognizing the anchor is the first step to cutting it. And cutting the anchor is the only path to the surface, where light still shines and the future can still be written.